Wonderful, thank you. So as Stefan mentioned, I've got the honour of guiding through our graduate researcher group through their speed talks today, where we're going to showcase what GIRG is and what we do. So who are we? Well, we're an interdisciplinary team, and you can see headshots there. Some of us are a bit older than those now, but they were the best we had. We're very jealous of Quaco's family photos. We haven't got one for GIRG, so we put this together. And basically, we have a shared passion for using plants to make cities more livable, but it's not just about people, it's about nature and biodiversity as well. And so to give you an insight into what we do, we put together this word cloud of some key words from all the researchers in the group. And as you can see there, obviously urban is a pretty big part of it, and green infrastructure. But you can see the disciplines there are ecology, ecophysiology, and we look at a lot of benefits of green infrastructure. So health, people interactions, cooling, climate change, and things like that as well. And for those of you that may not be aware, green infrastructure is essentially called green because it's replacing grey infrastructure. So replacing things like pipes and those engineered systems. And so it's about using plants in a way that can provide ecosystem services such as cooling, stormwater mitigation, amenity and wellbeing values as well. And so in terms of what is green infrastructure, it can be broadly defined as any vegetation in cities, and so it can extend to parks and gardens, but it can also include things that may be designed to maximise or optimise ecosystem services. So it might be street trees for stormwater mitigation and cooling, rain gardens, obviously for filtering out pollutants from runoff and improving water quality outcomes, constructed wetlands, and then highly engineered things on buildings like green roofs and green walls. And it's important to know that not all green infrastructure is the same, and they vary in their complexity and their function. And really the effectiveness of each of these technologies or types of plantings is ultimately dependent on what plants are selected, how they're arranged, how diverse they are, where they're put in the landscape, the level of inputs relative to the benefits, so how much maintenance, fertilizer and water do they need relative to what we're trying to get them to provide, whether they're resilient and diverse, and of course that's really important in a changing climate, and lastly what is promised is what is delivered. And unfortunately many of us would know of examples around the world of dead green roofs or dead green walls because it hasn't been designed according to what it needs to do and the tolerances it needs to exist where it is. And the other difficulty is that urban landscapes themselves are very complex, and when we put vegetation in them, we demand a lot out of it. So it's not just a tree to look nice and be a tree. We want it to cool the landscape. We maybe want it to provide biodiversity, and we certainly want it to look nice as well. But urban environments can be really tough, and this is a great one from Fed Square in Melbourne. Most of you know what Federation Square is like on a summer's day. It's probably the worst place to be walking around. And so you can imagine for these poor eucalypt trees that were planted in quite a good volume of soil relatively, but the irrigation system was faulty. And so they had no irrigation and they died. And a lot of what we do is about collaborating with industry partners, local governments and other agencies that are involved with urban greening. And our motivation is one of transforming cities and promoting uptake of what we do from our research. And so these are some examples of some case studies, some policy guidance, and also material about trying to tell people how they can build what they want to do to get it to do what they want to do as well. So today we're showcasing GIRG through 10 of our graduate researchers, and they're going to present very speedy speed talks on what they do in urban landscapes, on green roofs, and in urban forests. But firstly, just a bit of a case study of green roofs. This really gives you a flavour of one type of green infrastructure, which our group has worked on for about 13 years in different ways. And it was really about getting these to work in Australian conditions, whereas prior to that, they had been done in temperate climates overseas, but as yet we didn't know how to get substrates to work to grow the plants in, how to get the right plants, and to work out what kind of benefits they provided us. And so for those of you that don't know, though I'm sure it's not many of you, green roofs are landscapes on structures. So they're layers of engineered soil or substrate, which is put onto a rooftop. Plants grow in it and they vary in their depth of substrate and therefore their benefits. So shallow substrate green roofs are often inaccessible and they're viewed from above, whereas ones with deeper substrates are essentially like parks in the sky, and they can sustain people, lots of activities, and even trees. And so green roofs have the potential to provide lots of benefits in the built environment. And so they can manage stormwater runoff by holding on to rainfall after rain and releasing it slowly into runoff. They can cool buildings through insulation from that substrate layer. And plantings can potentially cool air through evapotranspiration as well. And they can provide biodiversity benefits as well. But all of these things depend on good plant coverage and the water use of these plants. And it's super tough to pick plants for green roofs that'll exist in non-irrigated conditions. So those shallow substrates mean that it's very hot and dry for those poor plants in Melbourne, and they don't necessarily survive those conditions. And if we want stormwater benefits, we need plants that can use water when they have it and can tolerate those dry conditions when they don't. And approaches that we've used for plant selection are plant trait and habitat template approaches. So picking plants that have attributes related to tolerance and survival, and those that come from habitats like rocky outcrops that match green roof conditions. And just to know where we come from before we go to the students to show what we're doing now, this was the first green roof research at Burnley, and it just shows a plant selection experiment that was put in winter 2008, and it's transitioned through to brown in the summer months of 2009, and then a bit of regreening in autumn. And essentially this was the summer of the Black Saturday bushfires, so really hot and dry. Substrate temperatures on that roof were 70 degrees during that summer. And so only succulents could survive. And so this is where we've come from. And the work since has been really like, how can we get a better outcome than a brown and crunchy roof? So today we're going to have 3 students talk more about the role of plant traits for plant selection. We're going to have Bihan discuss succulents, Zara the role of annual plant communities, Dean discussing what we can learn from spontaneous plants. Then we're going to go into stormwater benefits with Labana and biodiversity with Julia. So our first student is Bihan. Thank you, Bihan.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, I'm Bihan, a third-year PhD candidate supervised by Claire, Beck, and Stefan. My project is about green roof plant survival and a trait called succulents. Claire, next, please. When we hear the word succulents, maybe what comes into our mind is succulent plants. This word is origin from succulents, but as a trait, it is the plant total water storage in either leaf, stem, or root. This means that non-succulent plants also have succulents. There are many different ways to describe succulents, and basically, they can be clarified into 2 types. One is using morphological trait like leaf thickness and stem volume to describe succulents. The other is using the plant water content adjusted by traits like tissue, dried mass, or ash mass to quantify succulents. We conducted research on plants with a range of leaf succulents and found that plants with greater leaf succulents are not necessarily have higher succulents in 10, 15, 20, and 25 centimeter scoria substrates. One possible reason is not all stored water is available to plants for functioning. Thus, currently, we used plants with a range of succulents to investigate how plants use stored water under drought. We related the stored water, which is described by succulents, to traits associated with how plants use stored water, like relative water content at turgor loss point, and plan to relate the traits to plant survival under drought. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Bihan. And our next speaker is Zara.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Zahra. I'm a PhD candidate at Burnley campus. So as Claire said, green roofs provide a lot of benefits for us, but these benefits are dependent on a healthy plant layer. So it's important to pay special attention to this component of the green roofs. But the challenging environment that extensive green roofs create for plants has restricted our plant options. Previous green roof research has mostly examined succulents and perennial plants with paying less attention to annuals. This is despite annual species are abundant in some natural habitats with conditions that are analogous to green roof. So attempting to find plant species originating from natural habitats with similar biotic and abiotic conditions to those on extensive green roofs is called habitat template approach. Next, please. So as the first step in my research, I tried to employ, this approach, this habitat template approach, and find Australian animal species visual attractions which are distributed over dry and semi-dry parts of Australia. So they have harsh conditions, more like what plants experience on green roofs. Then, as germination biology of most Australian annuals and also the appropriateness for green roof application is not well known, we started with performing germination experiments on 58 Australian annual species. We examined the germination of these species under different temperatures and treatments, including smoke and gibberellic acid, to find out more about the germination percentage and speed of these seeds and explore ways to increase them, or in case if they're dormant, break the dormancy. At the end, 20 of these species germinated with or without the applied treatments, and we could use them in our future experiments. Next. In the next step, we focused on the functional traits of the plant species because functional traits impact plant fitness and consequently community structure and dynamics. Approaches which use functional traits may help us link the individual level to community level. Therefore, we grow the plants in a common garden experiment to measure their traits and relate them to their survival and ecological strategies. And finally, we created a seed mixture of 16 annual species. Some of those species we germinated in our germination experiment to grow them on green roof modules using different irrigation frequencies to find the least but most effective amount of applied water, which results in an acceptable vegetation coverage and visual attraction. What we found here was the lowest irrigation frequency we applied reduced the plant cover, but still the coverage was higher than 80%, which is the target coverage recommended by green roof guidelines. Plants were shorter and have smaller leaves under lower irrigation, but the functional diversity was not different among the irrigation frequencies at the community level. Our results indicated that most of the species used in our initial seed mix were good candidates and they're promising for applying on green roofs under low irrigation frequencies. And as you see, they're very attractive. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Zara. And next we have Dean.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. My name is Dean, and my PhD research focuses on the plant species that exist on green roofs without human intervention, many of which are your common garden variety weeds, However, in the literature, we refer to them as spontaneous species. Next slide. Green roofs are novel ecosystems with no true habitat analogue, which is pretty neat from an ecological perspective. As green roofs share similar structural and functional constraints globally, we can treat them as a repeated experimental unit, which makes them a good model to test ecological theory. Like many of my colleagues, I use trait-based relationships to clarify my work. For example, Peter Reich's worldwide fast-slow plant economics spectrum. And the spectrum contrasts species that rapidly acquire and process resources, i.e. fast, illustrated here by the sprinting dandelion, with species that slowly acquire and conserve resources, i.e. slow, the Opuntia cactus. Plant traits such as growth rate and transpiration can be used to place species on the spectrum relative to one another. Next slide. Presence, absence vegetation surveys conducted globally find a range of spontaneous plant species on green roofs. On unmanaged green roofs, spontaneous species will often completely replace the originally planted vegetation and form diverse and ephemeral communities. This slide provides a small snapshot of green roofs globally where vegetation surveys have been conducted, and on many of these roofs, the vegetation is primarily spontaneous. Next slide. And so with this in mind, for the final chapter of my thesis, I am conducting a global analysis of spontaneous green roof plant traits from data collected in Melbourne and globally by a team of researchers. The analysis will probe relationships between spontaneous plant traits and resource availability, green roof age and substrate depth, and surrounding landscape variables like urban density and climate. For example, we might want to know how roof age and substrate depth influences spontaneous communities. In fast-slow terms, as a green roof ages and soil resources are depleted, the ratio of slower species might increase. On the other hand, green roofs with deeper substrates may have a higher ratio of faster growing species due to the increased availability of below ground resources. This analysis will hopefully give us a better understanding of what traits are adaptive on different kinds of green roofs, which will help us make better planting decisions. It will also help to clarify the potential functional role of spontaneous species on green roofs and guide their management moving forwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean. And next we have Lubena.
Hello, I'm Lubena. I'm working on improving green roof retention by mimicking semi-arid natural banded vegetation. This aims at increasing water supply on green roof plants, not by extra irrigation, nor by increasing substrate depth, rather redistributing the flow of water, that is rainwater, onto plants from what is available. It is known that excess nutrients will increase the plant growth and decrease exposure to stress. This idea can be investigated using habitat template approach. In this type of approach, usually researchers have selected plants for shallow green roof substrates where they are pre-adapted to harsh urban environments because they have been evolved in natural habitats with similar characteristics. An approach towards redistributing shallow substrate or redesigning and adding surface features to redirect rainfall water onto plants has not been tested yet under green roof conditions. Next, please. One example of such natural local habitats that share similar conditions with green roofs can be semi-arid natural banded vegetation systems. They are commonly organized in a two-phase mosaic pattern. Here, rainfall occurring in bare patches of soil acting as runoff zones flows onto adjacent moles or depressions of vegetation patches acting as run-on zones. The runoff water accumulates in vegetation patches, increasing the soil water availability for plants, providing deep filtration for more plant water uptake. In return, new vegetation sustains and increases the capacity of plants to capture more water in next rainfall. Hence, natural semi-arid banded vegetation supports greater plants and vegetation due to extra water made available to them from the bare soil areas. Next, please. In my rainfall simulation experiment, cap-like features are introduced over bare substrates to mimic the behavior of runoff zones in semi-arid natural banded ecosystem. They are designed to redistribute rainfall equally on both planted sites. I would be assessing water use and stress of plants and would be predicting that plants acting as run-on zones will show greater ET and more water will be made available to plants and will reduce drought stress. This experiment is being conducted at Burnley Nursery using rainfall shelter where simulated rainwater drips from the sprinkler and installed above the modules. Next, please. This is a short video clip, shows how rain is falling over the cap-like runoff zones redistributed and collected within planted run-on zones. This study would contribute to better stormwater management approach. The need for plants to grow, survive, and thrive in harsh rooftop conditions could be fulfilled. This approach can overcome structural load-bearing issues and avoid unnecessary irrigational requirement. Thanks.
Thank you, Lubena. And next we have Julia.
Unmuting. Hey everyone, I'm Julia, a GIRG PhD student in my last year. And while I'm also working on green roofs, I focus on the animals using them. And more precisely, my project tries to assess the habitat and connectivity value of green roofs for urban pollinators. Next, please. As a first step, I compiled a quite comprehensive green roof database stretching over metropolitan Melbourne and now having 220 locations of buildings having one or more green roofs. As you can see here, green roof design varies and it differs in local characteristics such as plantings, substrate, but also maintenance. To assess how those local characteristics, but as well as the landscape context, so the area surrounding the green roof, is affecting pollinator assemblages, I will use the following methods. Next slide, please. So from the previous green roof database, I selected 20 green roofs. And on those 20 green roofs, I used a mix of active netting and passive bowl sampling to survey all pollinators interacting with the floral resources available. And those insects, not only insects, those invertebrates will later be identified to the highest possible taxonomic resolution. I also installed on Parkway campus an endangered plant species, the Dinella amina, matted flax lily, on 13 roofs of different heights. And I surveyed those plants as well as ground level plants for native bees using them to help me to understand how native bees are moving in an urban landscape. I also dusted all roof plants with fluorescent powder of different colors according to the height level. That helped me to better track bee movement across the landscape. Next slide, please. And all the data I was and I am still collecting with the previous chapters will finally help me to develop an ecological connectivity model. And that hopefully helps me to assess the current state, but also predict the future state of ecological connectivity in an urban environment. So here on the left-hand side, you see the local government area of the city of Melbourne, and on the right, a close-up of the CBD. The blue lines you see, they indicate the current ecological connectivity of green spaces for a species with a given dispersal distance of 300 meters. If we now add the existing green roofs in the area, suddenly all those orange lines pop up. And those actually provide evidence that even in inner cities where green spaces are rare, those green roofs can help as movement, as stepping stones for animals to move across the city. And this is a very simplified connectivity model. And I actually aim to develop a model that works in a 3-dimensional space, which would be much more accurate in describing the complex urban landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. So now switching it up a bit and coming back to ground level, we're going to look at a few examples of how we can improve urban landscapes. We all know that urban landscapes have become more important to us in this time particularly, and not all of us have access to the best quality landscapes. Usually with bigger councils, larger area to maintain on lower amounts of money, we end up with lots of parks that have very limited diversity, not very interesting, and are mostly unirrigated and can be dry and dusty places. So our next two speakers are going to talk about how we can improve the quality of urban landscapes with irrigation for cooling, and also thinking about traits to improve the resilience and sustainability of these landscapes. So we have Paul and Lavinia. And first up is Paul.
Hi everyone, my name is Paul. My project is about measuring the cooling potentials of irrigating grass. The problem that I'm trying to address here is the urban heat stress on plants and animals. And my hypothesis is that irrigation can increase evapotranspiration and reduce air temperature and heat stress. Next, please. Instead of using potable water, rainwater and recycled wastewater can be used for irrigation as well. Rainwater can be collected from the roof and stored in a tank for later use. Domestic wastewater can also be recycled, treated and recycled for irrigation. Next, please. One part of this project is in collaboration with Southeast Water and CRC for water-sensitive cities in a residential development area called Aquarival. In this project, in this part of the project, we use rainwater and recycled wastewater to irrigate a front yard next to one of the houses, and we measured the cooling effect from irrigation. Next, please. Also, we have set up an experiment at Burnley to measure the cooling effect from irrigating at different irrigation amount. The numbers on the left aerial photo shows the daily irrigation amount that we apply to each of the plots, and every day, and the unit is millimeter. The photos on the right shows the setup of the instrument that we use to measure the cooling effect from irrigation. We are measuring air temperature, radiation, surface temperature, soil moisture, and a number of other climate variables. Next, please. I haven't got any substantial results from the experiment to show you yet, but I did a meta-analysis to predict the cooling potentials of irrigation in different parts of the world using a linear regression model. For Melbourne, I predicted that irrigation can induce a 0.5 to 0.6 degree Celsius reduction in mean air temperature. And hopefully this research will shed light on the potential of irrigation as a urban heat mitigation strategy for Melbourne and the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And next we have Lavinia.
Hi everyone, I'm Lavinia and my supervisors are Claire, Chris and Stefan. My research looks at the potential of using Australian shrubs to create sustainable meadow-like urban landscapes. And this comes under the larger Woody Meadows project, which is a collaborative effort that includes 5 councils, Greater Western Water and the Department of Transport. Next, please. And this is the pilot planning set up at the Berrima, which for the Woody Meadows project, and this includes 21 species. The photo itself was taken in 2018, which was 2 years after planting, and the plants were thriving despite having no irrigation and minimal maintenance. And the pilot project has also received a lot of positive feedback from the public. Next, please. In order to achieve long-term success, there are 2 common challenges that plants face in the urban landscape. One of them is coppicing, which refers to the hard pruning of plants and involves cutting plants down close to the ground level. This can trigger plants to grow into denser shrubs with more flowers and then boost visual appeal. But plants, first of all, need to be able to survive and recover from the shock of losing most, if not all, of its leaves and stems. And another challenge is drought, which, like Claire mentioned before, urban plantings are often unirrigated or the irrigation can fail due to numerous reasons. And so plants used in urban landscapes do need some level of drought resistance to persist. Next, please. That being said, Australian shrubs are a good candidate because many of them can survive major disturbances such as fire and drought and can recover through sprouting. And we refer to these